Today I'm going to be talking with you on different types of classroom approaches to literacies, and one of which is critical literacies. And we'll be exploring what critical literacies mean and what it actually looks like in the classroom. And I think it's an exciting time for us to be thinking about critical literacies, especially in the area of, in the time of multimedia. How many of you, for example, are on Facebook? Raise your hands. Okay, almost everyone. How many of you use Twitter? Does anyone use Twitter? No, Twitter is not that. Okay, a few. Okay, fine. YouTube? You must look at videos all the time on YouTube. All right, and so we're going to be looking at ways in which these type of social media resources can be used in the classroom with English language learners today, but importantly, to take a critical perspective on using this. Okay. So, all right. So let's take a look at one of the prime areas of concern right now, which is that. Ken Hyland and Liz Lyons have written, and this is already 10 years ago, but the ability to produce and understand text and visual interrelations is now an essential component of academic literacy. And researchers, and I would say not only researchers, but also teachers, are struggling to understand and detail these meanings. So, if you notice English language textbooks recently published that are used at both the high school and university level, these modes of representation can be a challenge for many learners. So let's take a look at several slides. This is from an American history textbook at the secondary level, and you can see this is a rather complex visual, graphic representation of the history of how the U.S. flag has developed. And it would take a while for the reader to orient themselves to how to actually read this, because it actually is in a kind of a clockwise fashion. So the reader would have to know to start from here, where this was originally, of course, the 13 colonies under British rule, and then adding the original 13 colonies, the Stars and Stripes, and so forth, and then throughout chronologically to the most recent editions in the 1960s with Hawaii and Alaska. But again, we cannot assume our learners, just because it's presented visually, that they would understand it automatically. Okay. Okay, and here is another example. This would be, of course, the geologic time zone. And again, this is, if you notice, a very interesting spiral effect. And so all the different periods with the development of the ecosystems and accompanying forms of life. And again, the viewer would have to understand how to read this. So we're the development of the different ecologies. Okay. Here is another graphic representation of the global distribution of the world's water. And again, if you notice how it kind of almost telescopes out the components of the different water and their sources. Okay, and so that as it's slicing out, and then it sees here the actual surface and atmospheric water and so forth. But again, it would take a lot of scaffolding with our learners to show them how to read this. Here, I like this graphic representation. We can see the breakdown of the income in the United States currently. And so we can see the very top part of the population, which is, as you can see, how much income they're making. And then just in this one particular component. And then here would be the 90% or so, the average income salary. But I think this powerfully illustrates the income gap, the increasing income gap in the United States. I like this particular one because this was a graphic that was presented in the Los Angeles Times newspaper explaining the of us living in Los Angeles when we're driving on the freeway and everything's going fine and then suddenly there's traffic. Where did all the cars come from? And this kind of explains it. But the interesting thing is the way they detail the traffic, it looks like as if the cars are on a hill. So the viewer might think, oh, okay, this is a result because they're on an incline, decline. But no, actually, this is really almost metaphorical, just to give you the sense that you cannot literally see what's happening ahead. So again, we cannot assume that viewers would be able to read this image correctly. And so this researcher, Gunther Kress, has talked about a revolution in representation. And I put a question mark here because this does raise a number of issues. If this is really a revolution or this has been going on for quite some time. But he says there are two types that are going on. One is a change in media, which he says that the means by which we disseminate our messages and information increasingly are moving from the written page to the screen. And again, I would have to say, at least for those of us who have access to the screen, that is internet access. As we know, laptops and mobile technologies, they cost money. It costs money to have internet access every month. And there's a second revolution, Kress claims, which is a change in modes. And it's the means by which we create our representations from writing to images. So I have a couple of examples here from the New York Times. So this was the New York Times just about 100 years ago. And if you notice, this newspaper published 100 years ago, there are 7 columns going across. There are several headlines, but the font size is rather small. The font size, the text size of each of this articles is very small. As you can see, there are no pictures. There is a lot of text, heavy text.
This is the first one?
This was published in 1910, the newspaper. This edition. This edition was published 50 years later in 1960, I believe. As you can see, there were a few changes. Now, of course, we have a few pictures. Okay, the font size is a little bit bigger, but still there's a lot of text. Yes. Now we get to the online edition of the New York Times, and this was an online edition several months ago. As we can see, the differences are obvious. Not only is there much less text, the font size is bigger, of course there are photos, and then the other part of the interface, you can see obviously now there are video components, the hyperlinks, much more graphic details, so we can see the change of the modes of information. But the interesting thing about Gunther Kress and others based in the West, or I would say primarily Eurocentric centers of knowledge, who have been claiming that multimodality is revolution, part of this revolution. Of course, scholars such as your very own Dr. Lopez-Gopar here have observed that, in fact, there has always been multimodality throughout centuries and in many areas of the world. And this, of course, is the tapestry here in Oaxaca, and where people for thousands of years have been working with both images and text in interesting ways. But I think it's important to kind of think about how the text has been privileged in Eurocentric ways and how many English language learners are not only struggling to adapt to those types of texts that are imposed on them, but also the accompanying discourses with those texts, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. Okay, so there are new forms of textual interactions in schools, and there is I would argue there is a sense of globalized experiences stemming from interactions on Web 2.0. I don't know in your cases if you felt that sense of a growing community worldwide in which we can interact with people from around the world much more easily than we could have 20 years ago, let's say. 20 years ago, I don't know, when was the last time anyone of the students here actually wrote the letter by hand on a piece of paper and then mailed it off to the postal. Okay. And you would take days and days, you get a letter in the mail, wow, I got a letter, now it's email, email after email, enough. Okay. And there's also been the argument that many young people do identify strongly with social media. For those of you who are on Facebook, I've seen where people have extensively tailored their Facebook profiles to reflect what they want to present as their own public identity to their peers. And I think this needs to be explored because not only are these interactions on social media so important part of everyday life with many young people, but these types of social media themselves are a form of pedagogy, and they as such, they need to be interrogated because they are powerful forms of alternative pedagogies. Okay, so there's a concern for practitioners. Even though there's been a growing literacy on critical literacy pedagogy in English language learners, people like Sarah Benish, myself, Dr. Lopez-Gopar, Brian Morgan, Bonnie Norton, and Kylie Tui, as well as others, the concern is that exactly what are the literacies, as Wendy Brown says, that are relevant for an informed and active citizenship. That is to say, if we are living in so-called democratic societies in which people are supposedly given not only a vote, but importantly a voice in how we want to decide how our society should be organized and run and how those decisions affect whom, then we might have to ask what are the forms of literacies that are needed for that, for us to engage in a public conversation. I think I would say in the United States at least, there's very much the discourse of so-called experts who know everything, and then the rest of us who don't know anything. And so in the public, when we see something that we don't like, the experts will say, well, we are the experts, we know better than you. But in fact, as we all know, we know what is best for us in our everyday lives. And so we do need those type of literacies to engage in dialogues, especially with people who show discourses of power and advantage. And how this might look like in a classroom, the resources for an expanded teaching toolkit for teachers to use this with their students would use two frames. So the two frameworks would be, the toolkit would include critical literacies and a multimodal social semiotics, and they're both interconnected, and I will explain what both mean. So first, let's take a look by critical literacy. What do we actually mean by critical literacy? So Peter Freebody talks about the core concern about critical literacy is how we interrupt and name how societies attempt to control the interpretations of its members. So for example, let me give you an everyday example, and I was talking about this with several students, how the media frames certain events. Well, the media presents a certain event in a certain way to help us decide our interpretation of it. And I would say that, as Peter Freebody argues, that this controlling of interpretations is fundamentally a political project. Okay? Alan Luke has observed that teachers and students, both, seeing how the worlds of text, their everyday interactions with textbooks and texts, how they work to construct their worlds, their cultures and identities in powerful ways, how this is reflected back to them in text. Another example from the conversation I was having with some of your fellow classmates just prior to this was that, for example, in Arizona, the state of Arizona in the United States, there was a ban on the history of Mexico and Mexican-American history in Arizona textbooks. So right away, we have the kind of erasure of history, so where students don't see their own histories, their own cultures represented in textbooks. This can have a damaging impact on their own self-identities, as people like Jim Cummings and others have argued. Another important part of critical literacy, of course, stems from the important work of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire and also his colleague Benito Macedo, who said that it really involves two things. Critical literacy, of course, does focus on the important aspect of getting our students to learn how to read, how to become literate. That is what they meant by reading the word. They understand what these texts mean. But that's simply not enough, because what's also important is to read the text within the context of how that text is produced. And this is what they mean by reading the world. In other words, how does this text reflect certain representations of the world? How does it show the world? Does it show the world the way I see the world? And does it validate the way I see the world if I see it differently? Because sometimes we may see the world in many different ways that the text will either deny or just ignore. And so sometimes we may feel that, oh, maybe my view is not the correct one, or it's not valid, because these texts are saying another view is more powerful. So this is very important, this idea of both teaching our students both how to read the word and the world at the same time. And Hilary Jenks, a longtime anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, has built on this notion about, in the same similar way, about reading the text, with the text, which is reading the word, and then reading against the text. So seeing how the text has been constructed, how it can be constructed in a different way, whose voices are being represented in this text, whose voices are being silenced or not being represented. And so what does critical literacy look like in the classroom? There is a framework by Lewis and Flint and others have worked out, which is, I like, 4 components. And one of which we can work with our students is disrupting the commonplace, what they call that. So how is this text trying to position me as a reader? Okay. How is it addressing me? Is it addressing me in a particular way? So again, in the media, when we read in the media, for example, in the newspapers, if they use the collective pronoun we, we Americans feel that, well, then they're positioning me as part of this American collective who may feel certain things about foreign powers, for example. Another part would be interrogating multiple viewpoints. Again, as I mentioned, whose viewpoints are being silenced. Focusing on social political issues, or are they always apparent? In my conversations with teachers, particularly in the United States, English as a second language teachers, I wouldn't say many, but a fair number of them always tell me that they feel very uncomfortable about politics in the classroom. Like, well, I don't want to talk about politics in my classroom. But, ESL, English as a second language, it's not about politics. It's about learning grammar. It's about learning English. English can be fun, and when we talk about politics, someone always gets upset, and then it creates a bad mood in the classroom. Unfortunately, though, we don't live in a society where we can have that type of luxury because, of course, particularly in the United States, the position of the English language learner themselves is already politicized. Because it's politicized right from the very beginning with the invisible sign on the classroom wall that says English only. And unfortunately, I've seen many a teacher who will tell their students, speak English only, don't use your language, and don't use your language, your first language in my classroom because you'll never learn English that way. So already that is a form of politics, as we know, that is very damaging for us. Finally, taking action in promoting social justice. And again, this is another, I would say, step that teachers are sometimes reluctant to take outside the classroom. It's great to talk about these ideas in the classroom, but then sometimes it ends when class ends, and then students, they may feel a little bit left out, or where do we go from here, or perhaps even worse, become cynical. I think it's important, though, to promote this idea of social justice not only that starts in the classroom, but that will take the next step. And again, with many ESL teachers claiming their students are not necessarily. Other examples that tie, unite, or connect all of us, regardless of where we're from, of course, is one of the issues of climate change or global warming. That is an issue that obviously many people feel very strongly about, irrespective of your culture, languages, or background. So these are all part of issues that teachers can address with our students. And another final thing I want to leave you with this idea about, if in teaching the academic literacies or English literacies with our students, I think we have to be careful if we want to ask ourselves if we're just teaching the dominant forms of text and their discourses. So some successful students are able to take those texts and reproduce them and they go off to university. And that's part of the goal, obviously, to get our students to become more educated. But at the same time, if we're doing that, are we just continuing, are we just perpetuating the social hierarchy, where a few have access to or the know-how to reproduce these academic literacies? Or are we valuing or creating space that alternative, different literacies can be included? Okay, the other framework would be multimodal social semiotics. And this idea of multimodality, of course, is that we do use many modes to communicate, not just language. It goes beyond, or I would say, not beyond, but I would say a meta-linguistic viewpoint. So of course the focus could be on part of language, but language is simply not enough the way we communicate. For example, I'm standing here in front of you talking, but I'm communicating not just with my words, but I'm communicating just with my dress. I came here with a jacket and tie, which I usually don't wear in front of my own students back in Los Angeles. And so that communicates a certain thing. That's a certain visual mode right there. And so a social semiotic refers to all the different ways we communicate within a social context. And this, of course, is a social context right now. And these resources for these specific contexts involve all sorts of things, whether it's visual or sound, singing, or so forth. And it also attends to whose interest and agency is involved in the making of meanings. And what do we mean by the interest? Well, again, if we think back to the media, in whose interest is it when certain media representations are given to us? And then likewise, with the social media, there's been an argument that many people now have greater agency, greater ability to create their own forms of media. And we've seen this in the United States. I don't know about here, but in the United States we've seen this where the people themselves have been creating their own local media, especially in the context of the protest movements in Occupy in the United States, where young people are having their own digital cell phones, video recording police actions, and then presenting their own take on what's happened. Because very often when you see a protest, you go home and you watch it on mainstream media, you say to yourself, that's not what happened, that's not what happened, right? And so semiosis is part of that making meaning. And the multimodality is not only the relationship between the modes, but also when we think about why do we use one mode over another? In other words, as Kress says, what are the material affordances? And by that he means is that what does the visual allow us to express that the word cannot? What can singing express that simply talking cannot? Okay? So we think about that rich world of how we communicate with one another. Why do we use certain ways to communicate in certain contexts? Okay? And here is an example from an English language textbook. And we could examine multimodality here on several levels. And here was a chapter that I did with my work with my students. They were intermediate English language learners. And the title of the textbook chapter was called Emotional Intelligence. Has anyone heard of this idea, emotional intelligence? This started by an American, in fact I don't know what his qualifications are, he might be a psychologist. But his notion of emotional intelligence was to explain why certain Americans were being fired or being laid off from their jobs. It was not because the company decided to make more money or move jobs overseas. It was because you were not getting along with your coworkers well enough. You were not being nice enough. So emotional intelligence has this idea of that if we could only be nicer and kinder, the workplace would be a much happier place to be. And so if you look at this cartoon, what would you say their occupations were? Just judging from the visual mode. Yeah, I mean probably scientists, right? We know that by how? How do we know that they're scientists?
The lab coat.
Okay,
possibly.
so the lab coat, see, and this is an example of the semiotics, right? The lab coat itself, right, would be a sign of like, okay, well maybe they're not, for example, police officers because that's not a police uniform. Okay, the lab coat, and then of course here is a mathematical equation.
The type of glasses.
Okay, exactly. Here's another signifier where, you know, the typical scientist with the glasses, and his eyes are not even eyes, they're kind of just rolling around. The glasses are very thick. Of course, his hair looks like the kind of hair like Albert Einstein. I don't have time to comb my hair. I'm too busy thinking about important scientific discoveries. You know, his hands in his pockets, he's walking by, he's thinking deep in thought. His colleague, as we can see here, she's very nicely groomed, right? Okay. She says, "Good morning." And his reply is simply, blah, 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 with the math, okay? What's going on here? How do you interpret this cartoon? What's going on in this image?
Well, apparently she's emotional intelligent. But it is also an issue of gender.
Go on.
Well, she's the one that is handling the situation,
Right.
and he's
Right.
able to do it.
Exactly, and I would agree with that. Yes, it's interesting that I don't think it's coincidental that the woman is being shown as emotionally intelligent, but it's much more than that. It's the fact that why isn't the woman, right, being able to engage in her own scientific knowledge or thinking, and why is it here the male is shown as I have important work. I don't have time to say good morning or formalities, or to comb my hair, to make up, because I don't need to do that. Okay, and so this is something to explore with our learners, because we may, if we see this image, we may think, of course, it's a little bit funny, yeah, and then that's it. But I think we need to go a bit more with this, and I think this type of image is very common in societies where there is the gender representations, the representation of how scientists are presented as being the kind of so-called mad scientists. And this all is part of a kind of many types of public discourse that we take for granted. Okay, now, if you remember this image here, does anyone recall where this came from, this image? This was not too long
My
ago.
colleague over here said Saddam, perhaps?
Yes, exactly. Very good. Yes, exactly. That was 2003, right? The fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and hoping to stage the event. But yes, that is the statue of Saddam literally falling. Now, here is the recent, what the media called an act of vandalism. There was a statue of President Ronald Reagan, who was president in the 1980s in the U.S., and this was a statue in Orange County, which is south of Los Angeles, and the police claimed that some criminals were trying to steal steal the statue to sell it, but they were unable to do so. That's how the media framed it. But if you saw the preceding image, maybe an alternative interpretation would be this is not really an act of criminal, but it could be seen as an act of a political statement. And so here we have, again, this is the recurring image of the Occupy Wall Street, where actually this Chicano artist in Los Angeles, this beautiful graphic, he plays on that image of Saddam Hussein falling. And part of the making meaning approach with multimodality involves a functional approach. And what do we mean by this? And the work of the linguist Michael Halliday. So I don't know how many of you have studied the work of Michael Halliday, but his work is very interesting, especially for the implications with teaching. I find the work of Michael Halliday to be much more interesting and productive. Why? Because Michael Halliday and others have viewed grammar, and for those of you who learn grammars of other languages, and not just grammar of other languages, when we have to learn grammar formally of our own language, very often we have to learn all the rules of grammar. Right? For those of you who are studying other languages, such as English or French or other, how many of you had to memorize all the different rules of grammar, right? Yes, all of us, right? How has that really helped you in your writing? Has that helped you in many ways when you're trying to construct an academic sounding sentence? You might think, okay, verb, subject, agreement, that's important, but does that really allow you, that memorization of the grammar rules, does that really allow you to produce a sentence that looks just like the sentences you're reading in a textbook of that language you're studying? Perhaps. So an approach to viewing grammar as not just a set of rules, which is of course important, but as a set of meaning-making resources. In other words, how do we actually use grammar to construct the meanings we want to make? Okay, we'll see some examples. So Michael Halliday talks about the choices of making meanings, and that grammar should be really seen as a resource of language that provides us a range of options for meaning-making. Okay? Rather than a simple set of rules. Okay? And these choices are extremely powerful and meaningful in that they have consequences for how these meanings are constructed. We're going to see some examples. So, all right. One of the approaches to functional grammar is what they've called nominalization. And nominalization is how we take our descriptions of everyday processes and we turn them into a noun. Okay? So one example would be something like globalization. Okay? So for example, we talk about globalization all the time. But what does globalization actually mean? Globalization itself is a nominalization of many things that we are all doing in many different ways. Okay? Just in one of my conversations before the talk, we were talking about how Mexico has to buy corn from the United States. Okay, that is a complex process. First of all, there are many questions that might arise. Why can't we grow corn here? Why do we have to buy corn from another country? What's involved in buying the corn? Why do we have to buy a certain number or tonnage of corn? These are all complex questions. This is all encoded into one simple word, globalization. So as we can see, globalization, when we have nominalizations in our textbooks, it makes it very difficult to read and process, not only for native speakers, but for many English language learners, because one of which is it conceals or gets rid of who's responsible, whose agency, as we can see in this example. Globalization has enabled increased flows of goods and services across regions. Okay? So, again, who is responsible or who's involved in the selling or the exchanges of food products that people can easily grow here from another region, not only from another region, but from another country? who's involved, this has all been erased. So when we use globalization itself, it makes it difficult for learners and readers to understand who's doing what. And I think this is important because, as Hammond and McIntyre have argued, that this functional approach, or the social semiotic approach, implies with our teachers, for teachers, it's very difficult to deconstruct all the ideological and cultural assumptions inherent in any text without also directing our students' attention to the ways in which those assumptions are constructed. And so we see, for example, here, again from the New York Times, this was about a year ago, on the Occupy Wall Street movement, and the online edition, I don't know if you can see that, but it was at October 1st at 6:59 p.m. And the text here, the headline, I'll read it for you, says, "Protesters arrested on Brooklyn Bridge." And then the highlight, "After allowing them onto the bridge, the police cut off and arrested dozens of Occupy Wall Street demonstrators." Now, the edition that changed just 20 minutes later, online edition, okay? Now, here are the headline, "Hundreds arrested on Brooklyn Bridge," okay? But now it says, "In a tense showdown over the East River, police arrested hundreds of Occupy Wall Street demonstrators after they marched onto the bridge's Brooklyn-bound roadway." So what's the difference between the two texts and how they're constructed? Notice that we're using grammar as a resource for making particular meanings, and we're thinking about, our linguistics. I mean, whose agency is in this sentence? After allowing them onto the bridge, the police. Okay? Here, we construct the sentence to attribute, to show who's responsible, right? It was the police who allowed them onto the bridge. Okay? Then they cut them off and arrested. The implication in this text is what? It was
Legal there, they were legally allowed.
they were legally allowed. You're allowed to come onto the bridge, and then cut you off and arrest. So also, not only are they legally allowed, it was a trap, right? After we allow you, we're going to cut you off and arrest you. Well, you just allowed me. Why did you allow me and then arrest me? Well, the New York Times, I guess some editor didn't like that because it looked like, too much of a, it was a trap, so then they changed it, and notice the adjective in a tense. Now it's tense. Showdown, a showdown. Showdown means, sounds like one of those old Western movies from Hollywood, the showdown, The police arrested, so now it looks like the police couldn't do anything but arrest them, because it was a tense showdown, and the police were being almost, threatened, okay? Well, that's my interpretation, but you can see how they constructed linguistically the difference. All right, let's take a look at how a video has been used in a class, has been addressed in a classroom. And this was I'm not going to show you the video, but I'll show you the screenshot. Next one.
Actually, you can access the video if you want to.
No, it's not. Okay, yeah, I guess so. If you want, yeah, we can see a short clip. Okay, yeah, great. Oh, can we hear the sound? We don't have to go.
What these three companies have in common is all are based in so-called rapidly developing economies, and they are putting the world of global business on notice. According to Globality, a new work by Harold Sirkin, James Hemmerling, and Arindam Bhattacharya, colleagues from the Boston Consulting Group.
Globality is what comes after globalization. For the last 20 years, we've heard about the global economy emerging, but for the first time, we're seeing it happen. We're seeing companies from India, China, Western Brazil emerging to become real competitors. That's the sign we've entered the era of globality.
It is no secret that a lot of European, American, and also Japanese companies are in trouble, and the pressure is coming from emerging market multinationals. I think what is taking a sooner or later, competitive.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Why do you still know what you're speaking about? The global playing field is what?
Okay, and so let's take a look at the screenshot here. As you can see here, the opening, that was not, you saw that a little bit in the video, but here, based on that book, right, the graphics, we're going to get back to this, but here's the opening screenshot: globality, competing with everyone from everywhere for everything, a special report from Knowledge at Wharton. Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania is one of the top business schools in the United States. Okay, and you saw that. Okay, and we just saw Harold Serkin, who's the lead author, talking about what globality is. And here's the text. Is what comes after globalization. For the last 20 years, we've heard about the global economy emerging, but for the first time, we're seeing it happen. We're seeing companies from India, China, Russia, and Brazil emerging to become real competitors. That's a sign we've entered the era of globality. All right, so we're going to take a look at how an instructor and her students address this video. And so the teacher asks the student, okay, so global means what? And one student says worldwide. Okay. Worldwide, okay, does worldwide really mean worldwide? Does global really mean global? So when we use the word globality or globalization, are we talking about the entire world? No. No. The meaning is, another student says, the meaning is it have influence globally, or they have spread widely, so that means not the whole world, but they have almost the whole world. And the teacher says, okay, so we have almost the whole world who's not included. Like, we talk about globalization all the time. We talk about, the global economy, global problems, but are we really talking globally? And the student says, I think no, because some countries, they're so far from global. For example, in some African countries, they are so far from what's global, or they don't know what's happening in the world sometimes. Why don't they? Because they lack communications, they lack environment to encourage other countries to come to their country. Sometimes the political system in that country is trying to avoid any other countries. Okay, so here, the student number 2, makes several interesting observations about globalization, contrary to what the video would have us believe. First of all, the video was trying to show that we're somehow all interconnected, and that's how the dominant image of globalization is, that we're all increasingly interconnected. But he makes the important point, of course, first of all, that in many areas of the world, they simply don't have the infrastructure, the communications infrastructure to have extensive or intensive internet access. He makes the other observation, which is interesting, that in fact, in several countries, and he goes on to mention several examples, that in those particular countries, the system is very closed. So in fact, they don't even have access to the web because the government censors it. We know some countries whose governments have interfered or have attempted to interfere with Google, so that when you put a certain search into Google, it will not come up. Okay? Other countries, even if you would have the money, you wouldn't even have internet access because the government simply doesn't want you to look at the internet. And so this goes very much against the narrative of what the video is talking about. Now, another interaction on this video is when the teacher addresses what the narrator, as we just said, when he says, we examine how the world's largest firms and the most powerful nations are increasingly being threatened by emerging challenges with lower costs, innovative products, and global ambitions. Whose point of view is he speaking from? So here is an example of a critical literacy moment in her classroom, where you can simply ask with our students, whose point of view is this text speaking from? Is it speaking from my point of view or another point of view? Is this point of view matching my point of view? Why is this viewpoint being presented in this particular way? The student says America. And the teacher, well, how do we know that? And the student says, because he expressed the most powerful economy in the world, so they would like to still be the most economy, and they don't want to be another one to be competitive with them. And the teacher says, and I think it's interesting that he used the word threaten. So again, here, she focuses the students on the linguistic choices, the vocabulary choices we use. What is meant by, is implied in the word threaten? And the student says, the position of the country. Yeah. Country is the states. Yeah. And he doesn't use the words develop or change or, somehow alter. He uses threaten. And there's a sense of danger in the word threaten, the student says, seriously. So here, in this very short interaction, we see how the teacher with the student themselves are constructing different meanings, revolving around not only the word choices, but how it's framed in this video. Okay, and what it does is, as I argue, it allows the students themselves to help engage them in conversation, okay, in part of this academic literacy. That's neat. Okay, so addressing the multimodality here in this image. Okay, one of the questions we might ask is they were just focusing on the language, but how does the visual and the language, the verbal, actually interact in this video? Right? And how does the textual caption help us to direct our interpretations of these images? So, again, now let's go back to this image here. And what do you notice about this, this particular image of the planet? What is any interesting detail here that jumps out at you when you see this particular image?
But the reference to computing system.
Okay, right. Yeah, right. So we see the binary code, the reference to the computer system, the binary code, kind of encircling the planet, okay, which might mean what? Why would they choose? We know that the Earth does not have a Saturn ring around it. So why are they showing the binary code revolving around our planet? What do you think?
Well, it's like the simplest way how computers communicate in extension, for example, the internet nowadays.
Okay, so again, yes, exactly. It gives this idea that we're somehow all interconnected through the internet, right? The interesting thing, though, is here the text, though. So if we just ignore the text and we see this planet, it's like, yes, this is a very happy planet. We're all interconnected on the internet. We're all one. But here, the text, competing with everyone from everywhere for everything. Now, if you think back to what the video was talking about, the emerging challenges or the companies, they mentioned how many countries? Was it every country in the world? It was just a few, right? China, India, Russia, Brazil. So it's clearly not everyone from not everywhere. Okay. Now, for the everything, what's involved in competing for everything? As one of the students noted, that the viewpoint that the narrator was expressing was the viewpoint of the United States. And so this notion of this extreme competition for resources on the planet, okay, almost contradicts this notion of a planet being peacefully interconnected through the internet. Okay? And so we have this image of what may be called the ideal versus the actual reality. And it's very interesting how they positioned it, because if we think back to particularly Western-based paintings, and we see religious themed paintings from 500 years ago or so from Europe, usually when they want to represent heaven and hell, we think of heaven being at the top or at the bottom. The top, right? Of course, heaven is the top, and that might be thought of as the ideal, or where at least most of us might want to go. The bottom is hell, or the real. That's someplace we obviously don't want to go. But we also say that when we want to describe in everyday language, at least in English, we say war is hell, this work is hell, something is hell. That's kind of communicating this idea of everyday life being a struggle. So it's interesting how the image positions this idea of this being the ideal, or kind of a type of heaven, and this obviously competing with everybody from everywhere for everything is not my idea of heaven. Right? Now, the simple experiment to do with our students can be, we flip it to see, does this communicate something different, or does this provide some kind of a cognitive dissonance in how we might perceive these images? So these are all kind of simple experiments we can do with our students. Okay. Okay. And finally, the view expressed by the student in that class was really this idea of whose globalization are we really talking about? Is it this globalization, or is it this globalization? And this was from the recent Arab Spring, the protester in Tahrir Square in Egypt, where he holds up the sign, Egypt supports Wisconsin workers, one world, one pain. Okay? So this might be an alternative framing of what globalization means, that is, the system of capitalism that affects people everywhere. Okay. Finally, just a few other things on multimodality that doesn't necessarily involve, heavy issues as economic globalization, but it does involve equally important histories of people that are not always connected. So I did this research project with a Los Angeles Unified School District teacher, with her class of English language learners, and they were primarily from El Salvador. They were immigrant children and children of immigrants from El Salvador. The class was about 85 to 90% from El Salvador, a few students from Armenia. And we did this project in which in their learning English and their learning of academic literacies, the teacher had them read the graphic novel by Art Spiegelman, Mouse. Has anyone read or heard of this graphic novel? Okay. This graphic novel by Art Spiegelman, who was an artist in New York, tells the story of his father, Vladek Spiegelman, who was a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust during World War II, and who was put in the concentration camps of Auschwitz. The father and his mother, were somehow miraculously survived the death camps, and they lived to tell the tale, the story of what happened. And they told the story to the son, who then put it in a comic book form of what we call a graphic novel, in powerful images. And he used the metaphor of the Jewish people as mice and the Nazis as cats. And so something as we all know from everyday life, when we see animals who's the hunted, who's the hunter, in powerful ways this can express in a very particular historical incident, because the teacher, Martha, her students from El Salvador, many of whom had never learned about World War II, didn't really know much about the Jewish people's history, and really did not know anything about the genocide or the Holocaust. But amazingly and interestingly and powerfully, they were able to connect to these stories. How and why? We'll see shortly. So here is a panel where the father, Vladek, is talking to his son, and he says, wait a minute, they only trained you for a few days before sending you into combat. So he was a Polish citizen, and at the time the Polish government just sent him into combat against the invading Nazi armies. Okay? And here is when the parents is talking about trying to escape the oncoming Nazi armies. And here is a powerful demonstration of how visually, right? And so the road they're walking on is in that form of the Nazi swastika. This is something after we teach our students what the swastika means visually, that they can see this presented graphically, powerfully. It has an emotional impact that goes beyond just the mere words. Okay, here the father, Vladek, is explaining how they were able to construct these hiding spaces to hide from the Nazis. Okay, and this is very powerful. Vladek, the father, was multilingual. He not only spoke Polish, German, Yiddish. he was able to use all those different languages with the different groups of people, and that helped him to survive. And that sends a powerful message to Martha's students, who are of course multilingual, but as we know in the United States, that there's that strong language policy of monolingualism, of speak English only. And here we have a powerful example of a person surviving precisely because he is multilingual, precisely because he's able to engage with other people using their languages to help them survive. And one of which is that in his speaking Polish, he's able to adopt, Art Spiegelman presents the Polish people in the form, the animal form of the pig. And so here is this train conductor, a Polish, and he's trying to hide his Jewish identity by speaking Polish. And so here's this mask. And then again, that connects to a lot of the students who are struggling, working through identity issues in their communities. Okay? And again, here is a powerful example of the graphic impact of what has happened. Okay. And so we might think, well, these students from El Salvador, why would they be interested in a comic book about a Jewish survival from the Holocaust? But in fact, they were incredibly interested because the use of narratives and storytelling of our own lives, autobiographies, that link the personal experiences, all our personal experiences, with the larger context. Remember when we talked about reading the world of social, historical, and power relations, and why certain groups, as we see here in the United States, why certain groups are scapegoated, are being blamed for economic issues. And when the students were, and another powerful message that was sent to the students is that in the graphic novel, Art Spiegelman's, one of his many languages is English, but of course English is his additional language, so he doesn't speak perfectly. But the son kept all his grammatical mistakes in the text, fine, but that's how he spoke. And the students picked up on that. They said, yes, that's how he really speaks, because that's how I hear other people whose English is not their first language, and that's how they speak, and that's fine. It doesn't matter, because he's communicating. And the students also told the teacher, this is the first time we're become really interested in history, because in the United States, many history textbooks don't talk about these issues or are presented in very simplistic terms. And the teacher reported that there was a lot of learning going on. And so finally, we might think about this, what Kress and others have called a pedagogy of design. That includes not only with our students researching their own family histories and constructing their own narratives, but you can present your own narratives now because of social media, whether it's filming yourself talking about your family or interviewing, grandparents and family members in your own YouTube videos and so forth. And this helps us to connect across modes. This could also be part of a class project involving a blog or wiki project. And finally, why does critical literacy matter? Well, a couple of points. One of which is that, as we saw, I think, with the students talking about the video, it does help expand students' abilities to increase their meaning-making potential. And that is exactly what we are all designed to be, is to communicate with each other. And the more ways we're able to communicate with others, the richer we become. It's also important that it helps us with more active readings of these texts. We don't necessarily have to agree with these texts just because they're written in books. It also helps us to think about how we might want to engage with areas such as Facebook. For example, some people, which is fine, some people use Facebook merely to comment on their personal lives. I'm at the shopping mall now. Where are you? I went to this restaurant, the food was... That's fine. But other people also see Facebook as a way to maybe communicate other messages. Maybe ways to think about talking about our community. What's going on with the schools here? What's up with that? Or, how come our classes have been cut? How come we don't have more classes? How come there aren't more scholarships? These kind of conversations do take place on Facebook as well. And so finally, learning about the convention, in addition to written text, we can help our students design their own multimodal text. Okay? And so some guiding questions for teachers to use with our students. When working with text, we might again ask whose interest is at work here, whose agency is involved, what are the particular meanings that are being made, how are these meanings being made, as we saw the example in the New York Times. What semiotic resources, what are some of the resources, whether they're visual, as we saw in a cartoon, the scientist. What is the social context? And finally, what are possible meanings we can make by using these resources? What other possible meanings? And so, Mario Lopez-Gopar and Shannon have talked about the lessons that we teach our students, whether overtly or intentionally or mindlessly or inadvertently, or what will shape the world. Our goal cannot be to mirror the injustice and inequities of the broader society in the world, but rather to provide students with the skills, attitudes, and confidence they need in order to actively transform the world. I leave you with this quote from the teacher that I was doing the research with on my doctoral project. She asked, if you make students completely aware of their political situation all the time, or that you're constantly pointing it out, it creates a politician of the teacher to some degree, or at least an observer of politics and the political system and the constructs of society. So if we as teachers teach students through reading awareness of political thought and awareness of political structures, what are we hoping to do by doing that? Are we hoping to change the political system? So this idea of if we do address our social issues, are we creating a politician of the teacher? And this really speaks to the question that I would ask all of you as future educators. In your opinion, what do you think is the aim and purpose of education? And following the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, in any real democracy, is the aim of education simply to just give or teach the technical skills to the students who are going to be workers? Or is education really for everyone so that she and he will be able to participate fully in governing society and deciding how our society should be run? Thank you.
In a way, in your future as teachers, you see yourself choosing a text and saying, oh, this text is kind of very partial. Maybe I should choose another one, or maybe I try to give them both, and then we would have a nice conversation. What do you think? Robert, do you want to say something? You always want to say
For me, it was quite interesting, especially what Dr. Chun mentioned about the approach that was used by Maus in creating an interest about World War II and the Holocaust and educating the people through these different multimedia events. And that was really, for me, quite an interesting point, because normally it would be very difficult to convey what happened. And not only did that author manage to do that, he also generated quite a good deal of interest, from what I understand from Dr. So.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about these children from El Salvador, and how, I mean, obviously they have their own history, but any one of them and any one of us has a history. history to tell. So I think that it's a good way to show that you have something to tell to the world, and what you have to tell to the world, it is worth listening to.
Yeah. I think it's also important that, especially now that you are in el mundo real, right, looking for a job, right, you'll go to a school, you'll go to an institute, right, and you'll be giving a textbook, right? And maybe some of the people that work with Dr. Angeles, some of the people actually that work with me, we always emphasize create your own material with your students and do this and do that, right? And you go to this academy or this institute, it's like complete 20 pages of the book in one day, or do this exercise with the book. So you have so-called no choice because you receive a textbook, right? But maybe the power, I think, of the presentation by Dr. Chun is that what you have is the opportunity to criticize that text with your students, to say like, okay, we have to complete this, because the coordinator is after me if I don't. But do you agree with this? What do you think of this image? Does that make you intelligent? Does it make you feel good about yourself? If it doesn't, maybe we should change it. Can we change it? It's like you have the power to criticize, the text, based on your own reality, and I think the reality of your students as well, But anyway, any other questions? Yes, sure.
Bill, what is the connection that you see of what Dr. Chun has presented with academic writing and reading? Do you think that can be a little bit political or not so apolitical?
Oh, sure, I think so too. In fact, you can also challenge the forms of academic writing. I think the graphic novel is a great example of even writing activities for the students.
Exactly.
And perhaps to get away from the essay type of writing or the 5-paragraph structure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities to develop the writing skills by contesting in more traditional forms.
For sure. And I think that we can then make connections with, especially you who are now writing your thesis at the moment, right, or your papers, right? It's not all about just, writing whatsoever, especially when you add, photos, videos, right, words that you created on your own, maybe a PowerPoint presentation of your own history, then that makes it even more powerful in many different ways, right? You just have to come to us to approve it.
Just one small comment. I think it's pretty interesting that, I never thought of myself as a teacher, as a political agent, as a potential political agent, and here in Oaxaca with so much diversity, like cultural, ethnical groups, and I don't know, maybe someday one of us or some of us will be teaching in these schools where it has so much diversity, and it is really our job to have this text and material that government and schools give us to make it work for them. I mean, we have to respect their backgrounds, we have to find a way to make it work, not only for students who speak Spanish, but for students who speak other languages, just like happens in the United States right now. So, that's also an empowering thing for a teacher, to have the privilege to defend students and, prepare them for the further challenge they may face.
It is my belief that it's a starting point not only as future teachers or those who are already teachers, but also as students, because first of all, even if you're teaching already, we have to keep learning. I would say we cannot just say, okay, I'm here and I'm gonna stay here, whatever. So we have to teach our students how to go beyond what they see, what they read, what they hear, maybe learn. But also for us as students, we have to ask that to ourselves. I guess it's not only to people who we're teaching, it's also growing up process for ourselves as persons, even if we're not teachers probably.
Okay, do you want to say thank you on behalf of...
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for waiting. Thank you, Dr. Chun. It was great, and this is one of the many things that we have to think about in our school, in our society. So all the comments and all the questions that are pending there, you're going to think about this overnight, you can write to Dr. Chan and continue the dialogue. Okay? Thank you very much.